The psychiatric system, veiled in the cloak of medical benevolence, stands as one of the most insidious architectures of control ever erected in the name of healing. It operates not as a science of the mind, but as a pseudo-scientific apparatus for labeling, medicating, and subordinating human variation, transforming problems in living, as Thomas Schass termed them, into pathologized conditions that justify intervention. This theoretical framework posits psychiatry as a mechanism of social engineering, rooted in historical precedents of eugenics, state power, and pharmacological experimentation, where diagnoses lack objective biomarkers and rest entirely on subjective opinion, while treatments inflict measurable harm under the guise of therapy. 5968 EC. The myth of mental illness, pseudo-science without proof. At its core, psychiatric diagnosis cannot be verified through physical evidence, akin to a blood test for diabetes or an X-ray for a fracture. No immutable biological marker lesion, genetic anomaly, or chemical imbalance reliably distinguishes mental illness from normal human distress, eccentricity, or adaptive responses to adversity. Thomas Schass, in his seminal 1961 work, The Myth of Mental Illness, argued that the concept itself is a logical error, a metaphorical misapplication of medical terminology to behavioral or existential problems in living. Mental disorders, he contended, are not diseases of the brain in the literal sense, but judgments about conduct, often serving to excuse or control deviation from social norms. 571. This critique finds echoes in empirical challenges to diagnostic reliability and validity. The Rosenhan experiment, 1973, though later scrutinized for methodological inconsistencies, dramatized the issue. Pseudo-patients presenting with fabricated auditory hallucinations, thud, empty, hollow, gained admission to psychiatric hospitals, and once behaving normally, struggled for release, often remaining labeled with schizophrenia despite staff observations of sanity. It underscored how context and expectation shape diagnosis more than objective pathology. Subsequent analyses, including field trials for the DSM, have repeatedly shown only moderate inter-rater reliability for many categories, far from the precision of somatic medicine. The National Institute of Mental Health under Thomas famously distanced itself from the DSM, noting its lack of validity despite gains in reliability. Diagnoses as consensus labels rather than discovered entities. C. 5586 30 134. The DSM series itself evolved amid controversy, with revisions driven more by committee consensus and societal pressures than immutable science. Critics, including former DSM task force leaders like Alan Francis, have decried expansions that medicalize normal grief, shyness, or temper as disorders, inflating prevalence to the point where lifetime mental disorder rates approach 50% in some estimates. Without laboratory confirmation, diagnoses remain opinion-based, vulnerable to cultural bias, financial incentives, and power imbalances. Historical invention for control, eugenics, social engineering, and experimentation. Psychiatry's institutional roots intertwine with mechanisms of mass control. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it aligned closely with the eugenics movement, framing feeble-mindedness, insanity, and social deviance as heritable threats to racial hygiene. Psychiatrists in the U.S. and Europe advocated and implemented forced sterilizations, over 60,000 in America across 32 states, targeting the mentally ill, poor, immigrants, and disabled under laws upheld by the Supreme Court in Buck v. Bell, 1927. Indiana's 1907 statute, the first of its kind, explicitly included the insane and feeble-minded. Nazi psychiatry escalated this, with over 400,000 forced sterilizations and Action T for euthanasia programs that murdered tens of thousands deemed life unworthy of life, often with psychiatric complicity in identifying victims. C. 0AB. Post-World War II, echoes persisted in state hospitals and asylums functioning as de facto warehouses for social control. The CIA's MKUltra program, 1953 to 1973, exemplifies hidden experimentation. Unwitting subjects, including psychiatric patients, were dosed with LSD, subjected to sensory deprivation, electroshock, and hypnosis to develop mind control techniques. Declassified documents reveal psychiatric institutions and researchers as vectors for these illegal trials, blurring therapy and interrogation. While MKUltra was exposed and condemned, it reveals a pattern where vulnerable populations, those already labeled mentally ill, served as test subjects for psychoactive agents without meaningful consent. 2 CA11. Involuntary commitment laws further institutionalize this control. Individuals can be detained and medicated against their will based on vague criteria like danger to self or others, often determined by a single psychiatrist's opinion. This violates bodily autonomy, the supposed right to refuse treatment, while overriding freedoms of thought, association, and movement. UN and WHO critiques have labeled coercive psychiatry as inherently discriminatory, recommending abolition of such practices in favor of community-based, non-coercive support. Rates of involuntary hospitalization have risen in many jurisdictions, disproportionately affecting marginalized groups, reinforcing psychiatry as a tool for managing dissent, poverty, or nonconformity, rather than healing verifiable disease. 848205. Harm, not healing, pharmacological destruction and mortality. Psychiatric drugs, pharmakeia in the ancient sense of both remedy and poison, exemplify iatrogenic harm. Far from correcting imbalances, long-term use often worsens outcomes, as chronicled in Robert Whittaker's Anatomy of an Epidemic. Antipsychotics, antidepressants, and mood stabilizers correlate with metabolic disruption, including severe liver injury. Studies link psychotropics to drug-induced liver injury, DILI, with agents like valproate, carbamazepine, nefazodone withdrawn due to hepatotoxicity, and certain antipsychotics, clozapine, olanzapine, elevating enzymes causing steatosis, cholestasis, or acute failure. In pediatric NAFLD cohorts, psychotropic use associated with worse steatosis severity. Liver metabolism of these lipophilic compounds amplifies toxicity, especially in polypharmacy or vulnerable patients. D78FC6. Mortality data is damning. Observational studies and meta-analyses tie antipsychotics to increased all-cause death, particularly in the elderly, prompting FDA black box warnings for dementia-related psychosis, citing 1.6 to 1.7 times higher mortality risk. Benzodiazepines have been linked to higher death rates than heroin or cocaine in some analyses. Antidepressants carry FDA black box warnings for suicidality in youth and young adults, with meta-analyses showing elevated suicidal thoughts/behaviors in early treatment phases. Whittaker and others argue that while short-term symptom suppression occurs, long-term use drives disability surges, rising U.S. mental illness rates despite or because of expanded prescribing via supersensitivity, withdrawal syndromes, and iatrogenic brain changes. Historical asylum outcomes sometimes showed better recovery rates pre-neuroleptics than modern medicated cohorts in certain cross-cultural comparisons. 368. These are not anomalies but predictable consequences of agents altering fundamental neurotransmission without addressing root causes. Patients entering the system face daily rights erosions, forced medication under least restrictive pretexts, loss of decision-making authority, stigma that follows diagnoses, and perpetual surveillance. Compliance becomes the price of freedom, inverting the principle of informed consent and bodily sovereignty. Brainwashing the masses and the hierarchy of control. The system sustains itself through narrative control, portraying psychiatry as progressive science while pathologizing resistance as anosognosia or denial. Media, pharmaceutical funding, and professional guilds reinforce the chemical imbalance model, despite its retraction by leading figures, as gospel, encouraging self-identification with disorders and lifelong treatment. This manufacture of madness, chasse, normalizes intervention, framing noncompliance as illness rather than autonomy. Hierarchies, psychiatrist over patient, institution over individual, mirror feudal or carceral structures, where experts wield diagnostic power immune to falsification. Mutable evidence from declassified records, eugenics archives, FDA warnings, epidemiological trends, and critical texts. The myth of mental illness, Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic supports this view. Psychiatry, lacking ideological validity, functions as legalized human experimentation on a societal scale. Drugs tested and deployed on populations with minimal long-term safety data, rights suspended via civil commitment, and dissent reframed as pathology. It infringes the universal right to bodily integrity. We are supposed to have the right to do what we want with our bodies, while claiming therapeutic necessity. This edifice is among the most dangerous implemented, for it targets the psyche itself, the seat of liberty and selfhood, under benevolent cover. It erodes freedoms incrementally, one diagnosis and prescription at a time, while evidence of harm accumulates in libraries, journals, and court records for any who seek verification. True inquiry demands questioning not just symptoms, but the system that defines and treats them. The veil persists only through unexamined faith. Thorough research reveals the machinery beneath.